Can't remember, never go backwards. If I go back, it ruins the recording. All right. So this is a train of the Pennsylvania Railroad. See here, Pennsylvania proudly displayed down the side, along with the state symbol of Pennsylvania, the Keystone, which you'll see everywhere in Pennsylvania. But it's actually leaving Pennsylvania Station, New York City. And you can just see this big building in the background. Anybody know what this tall building in New York is? The one that wasn't crashed into by planes? Empire State Building. There we are. Okay. Pennsylvania, because initially it's the most populous state, but New York becomes the most populous state, but New York has a real focus of population around New York City, and the rest of the state, it's particularly upstate New York, is quite dispersed. Pennsylvania has these kind of two great points of urban and industrial development, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And Pennsylvania has a pattern of urbanization and population distribution which is much more sort of spread across the state. There's this gap in the middle where the mountains are, but east and west you get industry popping up everywhere, little pockets of industry everywhere. Now those industries come to be consolidated into the hands of just a few people. So we're going to talk today about the way in which Pennsylvania Railroad builds a monopoly over much of the railroading traffic through Pennsylvania. But this is just one instance. I could be talking to you about J.D. Rockefeller and the so-called Standard Oil Company, which would form a virtual monopoly over the production of oil, which is first produced as a commercial product in Pennsylvania. The world's first commercial oil well is in Pennsylvania. The first oil boom is in Pennsylvania. So on and so forth. So Pennsylvania is famous for producing these giants of 19th and 20th century industry and commerce. So we had to kind of pick one, a really iconic one, to convey this process of the creation of monopolies and then their eventual destruction. So we'll talk about it today with a whole lecture on Pennsylvania Railroad, and then I'll touch upon it again in the lecture on Thursday. I'll talk about Ida Tarbell and the so-called muckrakers, but she addresses another one of these great state monopolies, and she tries very hard to destroy it, that being the oil monopoly of Standard Oil. So we're going to get a whole lecture on Pennsylvania Railroad here. It's important in all kinds of ways. Also, it embodies an entire sort of system of huge monopolies. Obviously, you get a sense from the governance of Pennsylvania that monopolies are something that Pennsylvanians are relatively familiar with. For example, the machine of the Republican Party. Now, I'll give you an overview here to start the lecture, and we're going to work chronologically through the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad. So we're going to start essentially with its foundation in 1846 as a private company, and we're going to go right through to its heyday down here in the 1940s, and then ultimately its destruction. So that's the structure of the lecture. It's going to be chronological in nature. Foundation through its kind of thriving middle period through to its destruction. So it's founded as a private company, and I can see where this is a little confusing. It's called the Pennsylvania Railroad, so you might think it was a Commonwealth endeavor, but it's not. It's a private company. It runs through 1968 when it's merged with the New York Central Railway, and then in financial difficulty, and then 1970 it goes bankrupt. And it's a shock to the entire nation, because this is one of the great companies in the history of America. The fact that it could fail amazed people. You know this expression, too big to fail? That's how people felt about the Pennsylvania Railroad. Well, it starts in 1846, but 1870s, it's gobbling up smaller railways, building a giant monopoly, and it really thrives through the 1920s. It's the largest publicly traded corporation in the world in its day. It comprises the largest railway network in the world, with around 6,000 miles of track. Over 10,000 miles of track by the 1920s. So we're talking 1870s, 6,000, 10,000 by the 1920s. This is a steady increase. In the 1870s through the 1920s, in its heyday, it employs 250,000 people. There are only 10 million people in Pennsylvania. 250,000 people work for the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad extends into New York and Ohio and other places, as we'll see, but it is one of the largest employers in the Commonwealth. revenue turnover of the Pennsylvania Railroad is greater than the United States federal budget in its heyday. So it's a private company with a budget bigger than the national United States government. I don't know if anything even comes close to that. If you put together Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon, you'd start coming up to something looking like the equivalent of the US Treasury's income flow. So imagine something in the scale of those three behemoths of today, all joined together. It still holds the record for the most consecutive years in which a dividend was paid to shareholders. It is profitable enough to pay dividends to shareholders continuously from 1846 to 1946. Safe bet. And that, of course, encourages people to invest, which then fuels its expansion, etc. So it possesses the largest locomotives works in the world. The Altoona Works finished in 1945. Actually, they'd been there earlier to that, but they were expanded in 1945 to help produce materials for the war effort. The largest train station, largest train shed in the world is Broad Street Station in Philadelphia from the 1890s. Eventually, it loses that distinction, but at the time. So I just want to give you a sense of the scale here. Again, this is another reason why Pennsylvania is an important place to study. It contains all of these behemoths. It's a kind of American and not. There's a specific context to its creation. It doesn't seem at the beginning that it's going to be this huge enterprise. But you've got to think about Pennsylvania geography, where the state is divided between two economic powerhouses. God, I said state. Curse me. The Commonwealth is divided between two economic powerhouses. Philadelphia in the southeast and Pittsburgh in the southwest. Now, how you join these two cities up, thereby radically increasing economic exchange, is seen as a Commonwealth problem. This is a problem of the state as a whole. There's another context here. If we look at the early 19th century, Philadelphia had been the largest city in America, Pennsylvania at a point the most populous state, but Philadelphia is beginning to give way to New York City. Again, the reason Philadelphia was the original capital of the United States of America is because it was the biggest city, and it's bang in the middle of that arc of colonies. But New York is starting to take over as the biggest trade hub. 1776, again here you live these populations, 40,000 in Philly, 25,000 in NYC, but by 1820 there's 63,000 in Philly, 123,000 in New York, and that's because of New York becomes the main import for migration from Europe to America. There are some issues here about New York being a little bit closer to Europe as a port, a little bit easier to navigate in and out of as a port. You don't have to go up the Delaware. And New York actually reaches out to the Great Lakes by funding through New York state revenues the creation of the Erie Canal, which is a canal system which connects New York City with Lake Erie. So that you can now take goods to New York, put them on a canal boat, take them off on the upstream side of Niagara Falls, put them back in a boat, and take them all the way across to effectively the edge of Northwest America on the Great Lakes. Okay, all of these things help New York get. So the Commonwealth says, we've got a problem. We need to be able to compete with the Erie Canal. We need to compete with New York City, or Philadelphia is going to cease to be one of the great cities of America. So the Commonwealth makes a study from 1824 proposing a canal to go from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. The problem is the Appalachian Mountains run through the middle of Pennsylvania, and so how do you join up the east and the west? In 1826, the legislation is passed to fund a canal and railroad, which is called, and this is a big awkward name here, the Main Line of Public Works. It's works in the plural because it's commissioned in a whole series of little segments. I'll show you a map in a second here, but the idea is a brilliant one, that you can get on a canal boat, a canal bore, apologies for I hope you're not bored. You can get on a canal boat in Philadelphia and get off in Pittsburgh. you could tell I was really drunk by the time I was finishing this, just hanging my head. It's like, oh God, another lecture. And that you would get off in Pittsburgh just 4 days later. So you'd get on a boat in Philadelphia, get off in Pittsburgh 4 days later. Compare that to 20 days by stagecoach in worst conditions. This is a kind of worst case scenario. It's winter. Teamsters. Teamsters are people who drive a team of horses to pull a wagon full of goods. Before we had lorries pulling lorry wagons, we had horses pulling horses pulling goods managed by Teamsters. So we're cutting commerce time here from 20 days to 4 days. Ideally, work out. Well, here's the line of the main line of public works. It wiggles its way all the way across Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, which is the great port of Pennsylvania, to Pittsburgh, which is the great heavy industry center of Pennsylvania, where they've got all of the coal and iron and everything to produce all kinds of heavy goods. So here are the main points in the journey: Philadelphia, Columbia, Geneta, Hollidaysburg, Johnston, and Philadelphia. Well, right away they realize that actually we've already got, by the time they pass the legislation, they say, well, actually we've already got some railway in place. So let's just replace canal with railway for the first chunk. So they don't even try to build a canal over here to the east. This gets you over here to the Susquehanna River, which gets you up to by boat from Columbia on the Susquehanna River up to Geneta. This gets you through a canal over here to Hollidaysburg, where the canal boat is actually loaded onto. The canal boat is loaded onto a railway wagon. You sit in the canal boat. The railway wagon is then pulled out of the water with the canal boat sitting on top of it. It's winched up with steam engines. You can just see them here. Winched up in a big winding house. This is where the mountains are to get you up to higher elevation. It's then hooked to a locomotive which pulls you down the other side of the mountains, where they stick the thing back in the water, and you float again the rest of the way to Pittsburgh. This is a massive undertaking, and it is fiddly, and it's got all kinds of links which break easily, and we'll talk here. So we've got Philadelphia to Columbia Railroad, 82 miles. We've got what they call the Eastern Division, and I'm going to want to go back to the map, but I can't, so it'll damage the recording. 43 miles from Columbia to the Geneta River. Geneta River Division, which is 127 miles from the mouth of Geneta, which is catalyzed, up to Hollidaysburg. The Allegheny Portage Railroad. Portage is a word which means to take a boat out of the water and carry it, right? Portage, as the French might say. And it lifts the canal boats on railway carriages. So you back the railway carriages under the water, you float the canal boat onto it, you pull the carriages out. That goes over the mountains, 36 miles, rising 1,398 feet, which is, at the time, an amazing elevation to reach with steep terrain. When it gets to Johnston, it gets back. You put the boats back in the canal, 103 miles on over to Pittsburgh. So how does it work here? Here's a nice little illustration. Here's the boat in the canal. This is an actual poster from the time trying to get people to make the journey. You can just see here, there's a lock here in the end of a canal. It's open in this image, and you can see a railway wagon there with a kind of U shape. Here the canal boat's sitting on it. So you back the wagons in there, you close the lock, you fill it up with water. Canal boats float in, you let the water down, carefully positioning them on the wagons, then you let the water out of the lock, open the gates, and there you go with your train. It's an amazing piece of engineering. It's one of the largest pieces of civil engineering undertaken in America to that point. Unfortunately, it any money. The main line of public works is complex. It's unprofitable. There's another sign of my alcoholism here. A single ruptured canal in, I think, 1837, I think. They have a rupture in the canal, or the water escapes, The whole thing's closed for a year to get it back up again. That's a disaster. You can't spend all of this money on an economic linkage between east and west, and then one road trip canal, and it's down for a year. 1848, the Pennsylvania Railroad is chartered to connect Pittsburgh to Harrisburg by rail. Now, in order to do this, there's some remarkable... we're right here. Yeah. There are some remarkable things that have to be done. They have to get over the mountains. So in the way that the main line of public works was monkeying around, winching railway carriages up inclines with steam winches and so forth, they have to get over the mountains. But they have to find their own way of doing it. Now, the Pennsylvania Railroad conquers the so-called Allegheny Ridge, which is this highest point between east and west half of the states, with a famous piece of railway technology called the horseshoe curve. Essentially, they realize that because there's a maximum gradient for the railway, that if they just keep extending the railway, they look for a place in the natural geology where the ridge, the Allegheny Ridge, wraps around in a U-shape. And then they carve at a very gentle gradient over the course of about half a mile, a gentle gradient up the mountain on the side of the ridge. It's at quite high altitude. You just see it here in a stereograph card from the 19th century here. See how the train, it's doing a kind of 90-degree bend there in the turn. It goes right the way around. Now, even when they get to the top of Horseshoe Curve, they're still not high enough to get over the mountains. And so the Gallatin tunnels are blasted through. They're 3,612 feet long. They're the longest railway tunnels in America for a long time. And in fact, they even found the town of Altoona, Pennsylvania, which I think is about the 5th largest city in the state now. The town is founded by Horseshoe Curve. First, it's a camp for the workers, but then actually the curve and the tunnels become a big tourist attraction. Plus, it's a stop-off on what becomes this new railway artery from one side of the mountains to the other, and so it grows prosperous. And as you may have remembered from the earlier slide, the Pennsylvania Railroad chooses to build its foundry there to make new steam traction engines. And so by 1945, it's the largest steam engine manufacturer in America. Okay. The best equivalent to it in Britain would be Swindon, where the Swindon Works made all of the engines for the GWR, and it's roughly halfway between London and all of those destination points to the west on the GWR main line, like Swansea, for example. Okay, they've got trains running by 1851. So you can imagine the millions and millions of dollars spent constructing the main line of public works, building canals, putting in these winching engines, locks, the special carriages for the boats to be on the railway, etc., etc. By 1851, all that's redundant because the Pennsylvania Railroad allows you to get on a train and ride your way to the other side of the state. 25 June 1857, the Pennsylvania Railroad buys the main line of public works for a paltry $7.5 million, which is something like 10% of what the Commonwealth had invested to create that monster. In less than 12 months, it converts the whole thing to railway. And in fact, converting canalways to railways is very common both in Britain and in America in this period. Canals have to have a towpath, which is an elevated, flat, 2 or 3 meter wide place for the horse to walk along with a rope from the horse to the boat. A horse walks along this path and it pulls the boat along the canal. And so that actually has to be firm, that has to be good, firm ground with a solid base so that the horses can go back and forth, back and forth. And those tend to be constructed with gravels in a substantial way. When railways come, they say, well, we'll just put the railway track, which is standard gauge, is only a few feet wide, yay wide, we'll just put the railway track on top of the towpath. Because it requires like zero effort. The path is there, it's already been constructed as a suitable hard surface of the right width. The canal is already blasting from point A to point B in a relatively straight line. They just put the tracks right up the towpath. The Pennsylvania Railroad quote-unquote main line is the Philadelphia to Pittsburgh route via Harrisburg. This makes the Pennsylvania Railroad. It becomes the indispensable link for industry and commerce between the two great urban and industrial centers of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia in the east and Pittsburgh in the west. Hallmarks of the Pennsylvania Railroad are technical innovation and aggressive expansion. It is not a conservative company. There are lots of very conservative companies building railways one station at a time in various parts of America, in Baltimore. Pennsylvania Railroad is not like that. They make huge capital expenditures, assuming they'll get the money back in the end. It's a very different business model. So aggressive expansion and big investments in R&D, which in that respect sounds much more like a modern corporate model than your kind of 19th century gentle, mercantile, make a little money at a time type of model, right? Tunnels, bridges, they hire engineers left, right, and center. The U.S. government, the U.S. Army at times goes to the Pennsylvania Railroad and says, can we borrow some of your engineers? The Pennsylvania Railroad is a technological behemoth. It leads the way in the electrification of the railways. It begins electrifying railways in New York in 1910. Of course, we think of steam railways as being, cut short in a dastardly, dastardly government policy change in the 1950s. Pennsylvania Railroad is electrified in 1910. So we're way ahead here on the world stage. Pennsylvania and Western PA see electrification. Philadelphia and Western PA see electrification between 1915 and 1930. In 1934, the so-called New Deal, which we'll come back to next week, is a federal program launched by the United States government to kind of create jobs by spending money. Keynesian economics, the idea that you can spend your way out of the Great Depression by the government just printing money and spending. One of the ways they do that is to throw a bunch of money at the Pennsylvania Railroad under the New Deal framework, saying, go ahead and electrify everything you've got. We'll pay part of it. It costs about $77 million to electrify the East Coast portions of the Pennsylvania Railroad, but a lot of that money comes from the United States government. By 1940, some 2,677 miles are electrified. More than 40% of all electrified lines in the U.S. are part of the Pennsylvania Railroad. They have more electrified train lines than anywhere else in the world, Britain included. The chronology of this aggressive rapid expansion here. 1861, they buy the Baltimore to Harrisburg line. So these are important, significant places. Harrisburg's the capital, becomes the capital of Pennsylvania in the middle of the state. Baltimore is that colony, which would become a state, right next door on the other side of the Delaware River from Philadelphia. So you can now go Baltimore to Harrisburg. They kind of treat Pennsylvania like the center of an octopus, and they say, is anyone riding a train into Pennsylvania where that train doesn't say Pennsylvania Railroad down the side of the loco? And if the answer is, well, yes, then they go out and they buy that railway. They buy the whole length of it. Not just the bit that ends up in Pennsylvania, but they trace it right back to its source and they buy the whole thing, which leaves the Pennsylvania Railroad looking like an octopus with Pennsylvania in the center. 1869, they purchased the Pittsburgh to Chicago line. 1871, they take over effectively, they take over the New Jersey Railway, which covers most traffic in and out of South New York. 1872 to 1880, they in one section at a time buy up the Baltimore and Washington local train lines. So now they're possessing, starting in Philadelphia, they cover Pennsylvania, they cover Baltimore in the state of Maryland, the other side of the Delaware, and now they cover everything around Washington, D.C., just south of that. I'll show you a map in a second here. 1887, they take charge of the Chicago to New York line, Chicago being the one great metropolis out in the middle of America. So they get a stranglehold not just on connections from the East Coast to Pittsburgh, but now they got a stranglehold on connections from New York all the way out to Chicago. New York to St. Louis, the other great frontier town of expanding America. They take charge of that. Many remaining Pennsylvania freight lines are bought up one at a time between 1890 and 1906. This is rapid expansion. In less than 30 years, they come to possess the vast majority of railway lines in a big circle out around Philadelphia. A lot of these routes overlap, and there's never a complete monopoly. There's always a way to get from point A to point B without using a Pennsylvania Railroad train. And they're very careful about this because there's a law put in place, we'll talk about this on Thursday, called an antitrust law. What today we call a monopoly effectively used to be called a trust. And to try and dodge the law, they'd let some other company run the odd train up some of their tracks. And so they never exercise a complete monopoly, but effectively, it is just that. And most importantly, on local routes, they unabashedly hold a monopoly. This is, everything in red here is a Pennsylvania Railroad line. So you can see all of these black spidery lines, those are other railways. But starting with Philadelphia here right in the center, so there's Philadelphia, New York City, Baltimore out here, Washington, D.C. just here. You can see how they've started with Philadelphia. Their first big job was to get across to Pittsburgh here. So everything across the middle of the state is theirs. And then they start with these long distance routes. So you go from New York via Philly, Harrisburg, you get over here to Cleveland, ultimately Chicago. It's a behemoth. This is a little New York City and Long Island there. You can see they've extended right the way out through Long Island, New York. They even ran ferries back and forth to Canada. So there's good bits and there's bad bits. Can you tell that I'm a medieval historian by heart? 1277. What is 1277? Miss Abraham, you're the only person on medieval Britain. What happens in 1277? What war happens in 1277?
I don't know. I can't think.
First, the conquest of Wales. Absolutely. Yeah, sorry. So I had a little bit of a breakdown here. I've gone back into medieval mode. This should be the Great Railway War of 1877. But I had a little breakdown and fell into medieval mode there, so apologies. I can see there's going to be some tidying up here before next year. All the dates here are correct, of course. Yeah, it should be 1877. A bit of medievalism there. Okay. Between 1873 and 77, there is an economic depression. So the Civil War ends in 1865. There is some money for reconstruction. Eventually that dries up, and we see a big economic depression between 1873 and 77. There are 4.5 non-farm workers in America, and about 1 million of them are out of work. So, we've got over 20% unemployment here. Collaboration between the four great railway giants of the day, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central Railroad, the Baltimore Railroad, and the Ohio Railroad, results in those companies working together, effectively creating a national monopoly to ensure their profits stay up. Like, rather than driving down prices through competition, they say, all of our companies could lose some money, we're in an economic depression, let's work together and we'll all make sure the prices stay up. As a cartel, OPEC, for example, is a cartel where they control, as a group, oil production such a way as to maintain a price. They begin to work as a cartel. Between 1873 and 77, railway workers on the Pennsylvania Railroad and these others collectively take about a 35% pay cut. Because they're told, well, if you don't work for the Pennsylvania Railroad, you're not going to get any better deal on the New York Central because they're cutting their wages too. That's how a cartel works. They cut the workers' wages, keep their profits up, right? 1877, they propose a further 10% pay cut. On 13th of July, strikes break out. On the 17th of July, strikes break out in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh ends up as the epicenter of the strike. And the events in Pittsburgh are usually those that are synonymous with the title, The Great Railway War, or The Great Strike. Excuse me. Now, mill owners, these being people with steel mills who employ the industrial workers making all of these heavy industrial products, whether this is rails for railways, or steam traction engines, or other industrial goods coming out of Pittsburgh, mill owners actively tell their laborers that because the Pennsylvania Railroad has a shipping monopoly on that crucial link over the Appalachians between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, that they have no choice but to cut their wages or hold their wages back, because the company might go bankrupt. If the company goes bankrupt, they'll lose everything. And why might the company go bankrupt? Because the Pennsylvania Railroad is keeping the shipping rates high. This is a big sell here, but they really push it to the workers. I'm sorry, your livelihood's in danger. Your employer might go bust. Why would you go bust? Because the railroad, which has a monopoly, is charging the stink out of us, and we can't afford to pay the shipping rates. Not true. Factually untrue. But doesn't stop them saying it, because they, like the railroad, really just want to keep their profits up during this economic depression. But they've convinced your average worker that the Pennsylvania Railroad is the enemy. And in a sense they are, because they're cutting the railroad workers' pay too. So now the railroad workers hate the railway, all the industrial workers in Pittsburgh hate the railway, and on the 17th of July, strikes break out in Pittsburgh. 21 July, about 600 militiamen from Philadelphia are put on a train and shipped to Pittsburgh to stop the Pittsburgh riots. Well, of course, when they get to Pittsburgh, the militia, which, as you know, militia are not professional soldiers but part-time soldiers, like the TA is a militia. You know what I mean by the TA, the Territorial Army, right? Is a militia. The Home Guard, as we used to call them in World War II. So these militiamen, which are not well trained, they get there. The soldiers are pelted with coal and other objects. Eventually, somebody gets torqued off, and he fires into the crowd. Somebody fires into the crowd, and the Philadelphia militia fire back on the crowd. About 20 people die, including women and children. This is actually very similar to the so-called Boston Massacre, which starts the American Revolution, which happens just the same way. Militiamen are in Boston. This is probably closer to your stuff. Militiamen are in Boston. There's an angry mob who start throwing themselves at the militiamen. Eventually, someone fires a shot.
They were British regulars, but yes.
Or were they British regulars? They were British. They should have had better control than that then, surely, as regulars.
Some poor soldier fell backwards, his musket went off by accident. And then
so he says.
Well,
there was a trial, of course, future President John Adams and all that.
Yes, yeah.
All right. Anyway, it all spirals out of control. So now you have militiamen firing in the crowd. You have locals going to get guns to shoot at the militiamen. Workers go out and burn the freight yards, burn the railway's freight yards. The President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, has to call out the regular army. And he calls out the regular army not just in Pennsylvania, but in 6 different states, which are affected by the railway strike, because he's afraid this thing's going to get out of control. By the 28th of July, with the regular soldiers turning up, things draw to a close. But the reality is, this leaves terrible feelings of bad blood. And the Pennsylvania Railroad, far from being loved by Pennsylvanians, is actually loathed by Pennsylvanians for most of its history. Farmers, too, are hurt by freight rates, because farmers are reliant upon getting their goods onto the railway in order to get it to markets to sell. You can't be competitive selling your crops unless you can get your crops to the market cheaply. The cheapest way to get your crops to distant markets is on the railway, but then the railway holds a monopoly and they can squeeze you for every penny. So farmers hate the railway too. The good stuff about the Pennsylvania Railroad, well, they build all kinds of amazing civic works. Bridges that we're still using today for cars and roads, amazing architectural wonders. They build the entire network of stations that we've got in Pennsylvania even today. Union Station in Chicago, Union Station in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia Broad Street Station, and 30th Street Station, for example. There are a whole series of stations called Penn Station. This always confuses tourists, because the tourist goes to New York City and he gets a train at Penn Station, and they say, "Where are you going?" And he says, "Baltimore." He says, "Baltimore." And they say, "You're going to Penn Station then?" "No, I'm in Penn Station." But it's because everywhere the Pennsylvania Railroad built a station in a major city, they called it Penn Station. And so there's a Penn Station in Pittsburgh, Baltimore, New York, and Newark, New Jersey. But these are fabulous buildings which are gratuitously decorated, a bit like the Pennsylvania Capitol building in Harrisburg that we talked about in the big scandal in the previous lecture. New York Penn Station is the kind of crowning jewel in this. It took them 9 years to conceive and build, between 1901 and 1910. It's built in Manhattan to receive trains via new tunnels under the Hudson River from New Jersey and to send them out under the East River to Queens. Pennsylvania Railroad had been running a fleet of ferries, so you would get to the Hudson River on the west side of the river. You'd then have to get off your train, get on a ferry, and the ferry would take you across to Manhattan Island. Keep in mind the central part of New York City is an island called Manhattan, and it would drop you off in Manhattan. So on a line here, a little later than Burnell's novelty tunnel under the Thames, the Pennsylvania Railroad sets about to build what at that time would be the most extensive undersea or underwater tunnels ever constructed to go in and out of New York City to this grand new station to be called Penn Station in Manhattan. So they clear a large slum known for organized crime and prostitution. Hard to believe Manhattan's some of the most fantastically expensive real estate on earth. Now it's hard to believe that at one time it was a shanty town full of gangsters and prostitutes. But it was. So they clear that, and it becomes a marvelous civic architecture and public space. I'll show you images in just a second here. Opens in 1911. It cost $114 million, which in today's money is $2.7 billion. I don't know anybody who can afford to invest on that scale today except these giants like Amazon or Microsoft, for example. Here it is at its opening in all its glory, and you're only seeing the front half here. So notice the huge neoclassical columns from end to end, public clocks here. It's obviously even in the highest bit here, I think it's 6 stories tall. Again, it's about this grandiose neoclassical architecture here. Look here, it's like a pared down Greek temple. The same type of thing that we now have with the Great Hall on the new campus, which also looks like a pared down neoclassical temple. Which interesting political group in the 1920s and 30s was most famous for building public buildings with plain neoclassical style? You find them all over Italy and Germany. The fascists. And so some people have said that, no one ever accused the Pennsylvania Railroad, they were ultra-capitalists being fascists, but the style of architecture becomes synonymous with fascism in the 1920s. And so actually what you end up back in 1910 is that the Pennsylvania Railroad's at the forefront of an architectural style which would roll out across the developed world and eventually become, due to no fault of these people, synonymous with. Here it is in the sky at night, so you can see that huge neoclassical facade was on the front. You can look at the amazing length of the building here, and back here are the railway sheds underneath glass houses. Here is that central hall. You can see it here. Notice here, this is an imitation of Italian Renaissance styles. These are actually fan vaults here with these little octagonal alcoves at the top. It's a grandiose public space. Here's a view underneath the railway sheds, all glass. But alas, it was not to last. 1946, the Pennsylvania Railroad posts its first loss. World War II materials contracts and soldier transport. The Pennsylvania Railroad is the biggest single mover of soldiers around the country in World War II. Those all dry up at the end of the war. Falling passenger numbers. 4.5 million people in 1925 used the Pennsylvania Railroad. Only 2.4 million do in 1960. This had peaked in the middle at 13 million in 1944, but that number is hugely inflated. There we are, 13 million in 1944. That was hugely inflated because this passenger mile is hugely inflated because it includes all of those soldiers being shipped back and forth to East Coast ports because they'd been off to fight in Europe. And so, take that with a pinch of salt. There's declining demand for freight. 48,000 million miles of freight movement takes place in 1925. So you have to get your head around that. So that's to say, if we have a ton of freight and we move it 1 mile, that is a freight mile. You with me there? In 1925, 48,000 million freight miles are moved on the Pennsylvania Railroad. By 1960, that's actually gone down to 42 million, even though the population of America is rocketing up and industrial output is rocketing up. This is despite national radical growth. Poor management and a attitude are blamed on this. Fixed costs and competition are problems. There's infrastructure maintenance costs are overwhelming in this behemoth because all of that stuff built during the Great Expansion now needs maintained or updated. Rising wages, the unionization of railway workers absolutely hamstring the company. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the World War II general and later President of the United States, as President, he initiates the interstate highway system, which creates motorways, effectively, in America. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 authorizes $25 billion to create 41,000 miles of highway. Pennsylvania, these are I-80, which links Philadelphia with Pittsburgh. So you have an alternative to the Pennsylvania Railroad. Also I-90, which spans the Lake Erie shore. I-79, which links on the north-south axis Pittsburgh with the port of Erie on the Great Lakes to the north. And these are down around Philadelphia. I-76 effectively ends up being a replacement road for the Pennsylvania Railroad main line because it goes via Harrisburg. So apart from the PA Turnpike, which as all turnpikes is a toll road, apart from the PA Turnpike, otherwise petrol and diesel tax pays for the maintenance of that system. And so how, as a private company, will you have to pay for maintenance out of your own profits? Do you compete with a road system where the public purse is paying for maintenance through taxes? They've got a huge disproportionate disproportionate impact on competition. Old Penn Station in New York City, as I showed you pictures of, had covered 2.8 acres. An acre is about as much land as this vast green area in front of the building out in front of the Abbey building. Times that by 8, and you get a sense of the size of Penn Station. Modern Penn Station incorporates what's today known as Madison Square Garden, where the professional basketball team plays, where big boxing matches are held, and so forth. It too is now under threat due to neglect, even though it handles 600,000 passengers a day. How could the old Pennsylvania Railroad coped? Eventually, after its collapse in 1968, the Pennsylvania Railroad's gone, and the city of New York decides to pull down Penn Station, and here it is being demolished, right here. So the neoclassical facade's already been knocked off the front, and they're working their way back toward the Great Hall here with the cranes taking it down. And that's the end of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Can't compete with